Tom, in 1985, I think that you and Mouton and Peterson had a proposal before the conference in I think 1985. That was it was at St. John's. It was closed to the public. What happened? Name names. Are you tracking me?
Yeah. Okay, what he's talking about is the infamous, notorious 1985 manual that I co-authored with the late Mike Peterson and Ray Mouton. And that got this whole thing rolling. And we did that on our own initiative. Nobody asked us to do that, but I did it. We did it with the backing and support of a number of influential bishops and archbishops, etc., that I was rubbing elbows with regularly because of my job in the embassy. And I'm going to tell you who three of those heavy hitters were that were highly encouraging to me. One was Tony Bevilacqua, now known as Cardinal Bevilacqua, retired Archbishop of Philadelphia. Another one, believe it or not, one of the strongest backers all along was Bernard Cardinal Law. Somewhere along the line, he lost his way. And a third one was the late Cardinal Kroll, who, when he saw the proposal, I'd sent it down to him, the document itself, which was about a 100-and-some-page manual. And Peterson and I wanted to have a meeting with him, because by then, this was mid-1985, we were getting discouraged because the stonewalling and the stiff-arming had already started from the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I recall sitting in an office in the basement of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, across the table from Cardinal Kroll. And he met Peterson and I there, and he said, if I had asked someone to prepare a report on this problem, this is exactly what I would have expected. And he took that thing and held it up. So what happened to it? Nothing. Why did nothing happen to it? Because it was too damn threatening. And we tried to get the Bishops' Conference to at least acknowledge it, look at it. We had no other agenda except to help them to deal with what we saw at that time to be impending doom. Something that was going to develop into a nightmare. Because after the Gautier thing hit the surface, all of a sudden they were popping up all over because people were believing the little kids now. And the parents now were believing this really is happening and they could come forward. And of course the hierarchy, the Bishops' Conference, were the one, they went into siege mode immediately. So basically that thing took on a life of its own only after. And they met up here in Collegeville in May of '85. And they had a closed door executive session for a day to talk about this problem. And they significantly excluded anyone who'd had a lot to do about it, namely myself, Mouton, and Peterson. We were not part of that at all. I had one conversation with an official of the National Bishops' Conference a couple of days before this was to take place. And he called me, he was the general secretary at the time, and he said, Tom, I understand you've been talking to bishops about doing some lobbying to get some action at this meeting in Collegeville. And I said, that's correct. He said, well, you know, you're not supposed to do that unless you check with me. I said, listen, hold on a second, Jack. I'm an American citizen. I can talk to anybody I want to. And that was the last conversation I ever had, or Mouton ever had, with anyone from the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, or the hierarchy in general. Mike Peterson offered to have, the following November, a little open house at their conference to discuss this issue with them. He had it at the November meeting. He had opened his suite up. He took a suite at the hotel and invited them down to discuss the issue of sexual abuse of kids by the clergy, how we're going to deal with this. And 12 bishops came out of the 400 or some, or 300 or some that were staying at the hotel. He later on went over to Rome and tried to do get some action with the hierarchy in Rome, the Vatican bureaucracy. And I remember the day he came back, because he and I went out together, and we drowned our sorrows. Because Mike was discouraged, he was angry because he said they aren't going to do anything. They don't care. I will never forget that night as long as I live. And essentially, that has been the sorrow. I mean, when I started reading Jason's book again, The Vows of Silence, I had to stop at a couple points because it was getting me both sad, angry, and discouraged because I was reliving, as the victims say, I was being triggered by the nightmare And I didn't even realize how big a nightmare it was then. Does that answer your question?
It's amazing how this issue kind of sweeps you up and carries you off on a wave, and you find out that now all of a sudden you're not just dealing with the crime of pedophilia. Curious things that have gone on in places like Cleveland, Ohio, in Chicago, Illinois, and guys like Cardinal Bernardino and Andrew Greeley, who make these statements in books that they publish about these boys' club sex rings where priests recruited mostly inner-city children to engage in these sex rings with seminarians and priests, and that this was a sort of satanic ritual that replicated stuff that took place in Rome centuries ago. And I'd just like somebody to sort of either correct me or tell me that this isn't true so I can get on to some other stuff. But is there any truth to this stuff? I'm hoping that either Jason or Tom could comment on that.
Do we have something? The passage in Greeley's book has aroused a lot of people, where he refers to that ring. And to my knowledge, there has never been any reporting that goes into depth on who these individuals are. There's some speculation that he may have put it out there as to let people know that he had information almost as a way of guarding against and keeping people from going after him. I don't know. I'm aware of the Pellegrini murder, and I've heard different people talk about it. So far as I know, no one in Chicago has ever gotten to the bottom of it.
I have more credence in the whole business about ritual abuse, satanic ritualistic abuse than some do, but I will also readily admit that while it was extremely painful and difficult for me at the very beginning of my odyssey to wrap my mind around the propensity of sexual abuse by the clerics, I mean, I couldn't, cognitively I knew what was going on because I had concrete proof in front of me, but to emotionally get involved in it and you know, get yourself really there, and it's the same thing with the ritual stuff. It's so far-fetched, it's so alien to me personally, but I have seen concrete evidence from law enforcement agencies that there is significant amount. Now, Ken Lanning, several years ago, wrote it off. He's an FBI specialist in it. But since that time, there's been significant evidence that has come forward. Now, on this business here, I think, I'm not going to comment on those three cases. I'm just going to say I think there is a real danger in all of this of being caught up in, for lack of a better term, right-wing paranoid thinking and saying that all this stuff is somehow interactive and it's part of either a left-wing conspiracy or a right-wing conspiracy or something like that. We can drive ourselves nuts if we let ourselves get off the track.
Thank you for being here. The pain that you've all in various degrees have suffered, your commitment and willingness to go forth and not be pleasantly supported by people who should be helping you. And in my own thoughts, have courage in what you have accomplished and an issue that's coming forth that cannot go away. And I still have great optimism and faith that what you're doing and other people are doing is going to come to some fruition. It's just a comment, but any reaction to that is fine. But you've done some wonderful things in what you're doing, and you're helping other people become more informed. And many people work in areas of justice too, along with you, or in different areas of justice. And we are the church. Yes, I very much appreciate that. Thank you.
That what your objective was to return the church to an era of responsibility, or to restore responsibility to the church. And so I'm not trying to be flip or cynical, but I would just ask you, since my personal experience is that's what I've been trying to sift, reverse engineering to try to find where that time is. I'd just like to ask you, when is that place? And as a follow-up that's closely related, I would just ask that if we are to believe that there is reason to work with this institution, then it seems to me that we have to have a reason to believe that its hierarchy is not evil incarnate. And as I've listened to the rest of the panelists tonight talk about this, all I've heard is more indictments and more moral corruption. So my question, again, very respectfully, is what is their rationale then? What man, has a legitimate moral argument that they can do this?
Let me start with the last part of your question first. I think everything that we're doing in terms of the church is predicated on the fact that the church is not defined by the actions of the hierarchy. The church is not the hierarchy. The church is not just the buildings. The church is, I think Vatican II probably said it best, the people of God. And so if you start with that kind of a vision of the church and the responsibilities that Catholics are called to because of their baptism, it puts us in a position where we have no choice. Because some people would argue that the bishops have put themselves in a position where they're trying to usurp the church for themselves and make it their church. But that isn't the case. It would almost be, if I can use this as kind of a radical example, it's almost like the overthrow of a government. From our perspective, if you just take a look at their actions, they view it as their church. And so everything that we're talking about here, the responsibility that we're talking about, starts with an acknowledgement. It has to start with something inside that is going to move Catholics and people to action. Because if everybody has a feeling that they're upset and nobody does anything, it doesn't do any good. And so what we're struggling with, number one, how do we translate the feelings that we know a lot of people have to action, and what have we learned about what are those correct actions? So we're kind of really coming up two learning curves at the same time, but it's all predicated in the notion that, the Vatican II notion, that the church is defined as the people of God, and that it is not the bishop's church.
I just wanted to add something to that. Sexual corruption is to the Roman Catholic hierarchy as money is to politicians in a democracy. 9 times out of 10, when there's corruption in a democracy, government, it has to do with money. Every now and then, it's sex or drugs or something like that. Most of the big stuff, except in Washington where it's foreign policy crimes, most of it's money. Somebody's on the take. So crimes of money are to politics what crimes of sex are to the Roman Catholic hierarchy. And of course, schooled as we are in this faith to believe, as Richard so eloquently spoke about the celibate morality, we're witnessing a vast revolution in the mind of Catholicism in our time. And we're living in a narrative that is unfolding day by day, week by week, and not to mix metaphors, but there are plenty of landmines out there right now. Robert Lynch, Bishop of St. Petersburg, paid $100,000 to resolve a sexual harassment claim brought by his press spokesman. Why is Robert Lynch a bishop? Frank Rodheimer was the Bishop of Paterson, New Jersey, who paid $250,000 from diocesan funds to resolve the claim against him in a lawsuit because for 10 summers he had a place on the New Jersey shore where he and a priest named Peter Osinski went, and Osinski brought a boy summer after summer. Osinski went to prison. Why is Frank Rodheimer a bishop? Dallas, Texas, they sent a coadjutor bishop after the Rudy Koss trial in 1997 that resulted in that huge verdict. Galante was the coadjutor bishop who went to Dallas. He stayed there for 4 years, because Grauman wouldn't leave. This is a problem of papal authority. When the papal nuncio, Montalvo, the Archbishop in Washington, who is the Vatican ambassador, will not respond to letters from Bob Bennett, the lawyer for the Reformed National Review Board, I mean, this is a stiff arm. The problem is the power structure. How do we change the power structure? Money, obviously, is one source of pressure. I think there is a very powerful instrument in Catholic mothers organizing on the basis of being Catholic mothers. I think it is very tough for any bishop not to meet with a group of Catholic mothers. What this hierarchy so desperately lacks is maternal grace. I'll say any kind of grace, but I mean, these guys don't know what it's like to hold that baby with colic at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, some of us who are fathers have done that, but the moms have done it a lot more. And it's that mentality of child rearing in which they are unlettered that is so important, in my view, to bring to bear upon these people. So I think the organizing of Catholic mothers can be a very powerful force that will generate media coverage. Lastly, I want to give you all one image to think about. One of the most striking pieces of information I came across in doing this new book had to do with a chain of events in Canada. A group of what we would call Native Americans, First Nations people, Indians, living far beyond Vancouver. A bishop was removed. Hubert O'Connor was his name. He was actually in Rome in 1992 for the canonization of the first Canadian saint. When he got the word from back home, you're in trouble. Well, he goes home, and what does he do? The first thing he does is put a letter in the diocesan newspaper saying, well, I'm innocent, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, eventually he was indicted for rape. 2 young women, early in his priesthood, were servants for the priests. One of them he impregnated, and the other he merely had sex with. The one who was impregnated lost that baby after 1 day. He put that child up for adoption. The other woman eventually got a prosecution. He was convicted. He went to prison for 6 months, and then the conviction was overturned on a technicality. And so the members of this First Nations community then decided, based on this woman's traumatized experience with the legal system, and I'm sure there are many of you all here today who've gone through the difficulties of litigation, much less trying to assist a criminal prosecution. So they cut a deal. They basically said, okay, we're not going to prosecute again, but you've got to agree to meet with us for a day. And so on a long July afternoon, over 7 hours, 38 people made a huge circle. And that bishop, who was no longer functioning as a bishop, and the man who had replaced him, the new bishop, sat in that circle and listened to what all of these First Nations people said. I think we need to build 1 million circles around the institutionalized mendacity, the walls of structural lying that the hierarchy has erected to keep us from getting to the other side where the church, that voice of the faithful, wants to build, should, and can be built. And I think in all of those communities where we can get bishops to sit down and spend a day and listen to survivors, I think it will have an effect. And the reason I am strongly convinced that a meeting with the Pope will have an impact is precisely because of what happened when John Paul issued the document in 1987 on the Holocaust, Shoah, we remember. He went and met with rabbis in Rome, and my friends, within a week, bishops and cardinals across the world began to meet with rabbis in the Jewish community. the power of symbolism can be very strong if it's the right symbol. And the tough part will be the negotiating to get someone close to the Pope to agree to have that meeting. It may not come with this Pope, it may be the next Pope. But rather than view it as evil incarnate, I view this as a corrupted power structure. And let's face it, we are citizens in a democracy, and the church desperately needs a separation of powers. There needs to be an independent judiciary in the Catholic Church. The Code of Canon Law does not work. The Pope can intervene at any time in any proceeding and halt, abort, or reverse it. So, if there is some independent mechanism, both for justice in that sense, but also to make sure, for example, that the bishop is spending the money the right way, or he's not recycling pedophiles or hiding people with other kinds of sexual baggage, that's the purpose of a separation of powers.
Next question.
Well, I feel humbled being here with survivors of clergy abuse and with our panel. Bob and Belinda came to Winona and spoke to our Voice of the Faithful in Winona. My name is Mary Sherman. I'm co-chair from Winona. Tom is one of our staunch supporters in Winona, Voice of the Faithful. Jim Allaire, the founder of Voice of the Faithful in Winona, I believe some of you know him up here. He came up and met with you at Cox Christi. My sister is chairperson of Voice of the Faithful in Fort Worth, and I think Jason Berry, you met her the other night. I'm heartbroken. I am a mother, and I think that is what you said, Jason. That is the most profound hurt that I feel, that our moral leaders took our children and destroyed their spiritual lives. They tell us that life is sanctified, life is holy, marriage is an image of God, all of this. And then they took our children and they did these things to our children. Total disregard for all of the things they told us. I have a question. We met with the top people at the Chancery Wednesday of this week. The Vicar General, the victim's advocate, who is not a victim's advocate, she's a pastoral something.
Pastoral care specialist.
There you go, pastoral care specialist, definitely not an advocate. And then a young priest who is quite remarkable. There was a team of Voice of the Faithful, 5 of us, 2 men, 3 women. The Vicar General never looked us in the eye. The entire time he took notes. At very little did he look us in the eye. He did make eye contact with Tom. They started off, the way they start all their meetings off, they wanted to read the gospel for this Sunday, and then they wanted everyone to say something about what it meant to them. Well, unfortunately, the gospel for this Sunday is the woman caught in adultery. And we went, oh, this is great. I thought, just wait. So, yes, they read it. And they started going around the circle, and the Vicar General started, I believe, and said how Jesus wants everything to end happy. And I was, this is true. I tell you, this is true. Then, they got to Jim Allaire, and he had quite a succinct comment to make for them. And I was next, and they asked me, how this affected my life, what I thought of it. And I said, well, what I think of it is the moral leadership at that time was corrupt. And that they intimidated this woman in front of Christ. And he took care of it. I said, that's what it means to me. My question is this. We presented them with a list of we know of 4 known perpetrators for sure in the Winona Diocese, which is spread all over the southern part of the map there. And we know Jim Allaire did research somewhat like Melinda, and he found out that they were represented in 26 parishes. We gave them the list, and we told them what we want them to do is to go and speak from the pulpit in each of those parishes and tell the people there was a perpetrator in your midst. If you know of anyone, you know what we want them to do. They said they would talk this over, they would review what we said, and they would make the best decision. That's what they said. So, can you help us? We think we're going to go forward publicly. We think it's going in the newspaper. We need a little direction on, we are being stonewalled in Winona.
You are being stonewalled, and you are being lied to. And I guess I was on the inside, outside, upside down, or whatever you want to call it, but my suggestion, and then I'll pass it to the rest of the politicians up here, would simply be, don't back off, don't be afraid to go public, and as Dick so eloquently said, we all are subjected to that religious duress. When we see the black suits and all that, there's a fear that creeps up, that somehow there's something in the midst. But you have to understand that one of the reasons the hierarchy and the certain segments of the clerical world are so fearful of voice of the faithful is not because there's a hidden agenda of a women's ordination, men's ordination, married men. That's not the point. The point is fear that the power and the corruption is being challenged. That's the point. And I think that's what you're doing. So I would say, keep it up. Go public. Don't be afraid to. Because they're going to think about it, and they've already thought about it. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. You can be sure of that.
I'd just like to echo that. Remember, Father Mann was in charge of planning in the diocese for a long time. Father Hepner can't look you straight in the face because, remember, he's the one who had Father McGrath appointed as a judicial vicar who was picked up. And you have numerous perpetrators that have passed through the diocese. And the seminary has had its troubles, and the seminary knows, as well as Bishop Harrington knows, that those closets are going to be reopened as the California litigation continues because Bishop Brahm from Winona originally via Duluth is now in San Diego, and he has 100 and some cases he's looking in the face at. So I give you some courage to go straight ahead because the system is completely corrupt, and they're compromised all the way through, person by person by person, in the entire Winona diocese. And so there are a couple really good young priests, I have to admit, in my opinion. But as far as in general, the older guys know, and the older guys have maintained silence. And so that's what you're trying to overcome. And I just ask you to keep going, keep charging, and we'll get them on the West Coast and blow that door open for you.
And let me just make a couple, go ahead. Well, let me just, a couple of quick nuts and bolts. I applaud what you're doing, and I would just beg you to go out and find their victims. If you go to our website, snapnetwork.org, there's a little thing called Reaching Out or something like that, and you can just download some of our flyers, and the flyers simply say, abused by a priest, there's help. You know, we're a confidential self-help organization, and you know, if you've got a lot of courage, hand them out to the parishioners. If you're not quite there yet, go at 10:15 after the 10 o'clock Mass starts and put them on the car windshields, because if those victims come forward and if they speak to the press, if they file a civil lawsuit, if they file a criminal complaint, it doesn't matter what the chancery does or doesn't do. That perpetrator's name will get in the paper, and then people will be warned. And you know, we can't control what the hierarchy does at all, but we can control what we do, and we can find those lost sheep. We can lead by example. We can do the bishop's job for him.
But still, people want to buy into that oh, well, church law protects the priest, and we've got our own situation. How do you get the media to distinguish between the two, to tell people that canon law really has no application in these cases?
I refer to the church's internal personnel policies, and I try to make analogies with the corporate world and say, you know, if somebody was caught, you know, working at the 7-Eleven and raping children, nothing the 7-Eleven Corporation could say about their own internal personnel policies would be allowed to even enter the discussion. But you're absolutely right. The canon law is held out as this immutable, perfect, fixed, historic, traditional system, and it's used, I think, frankly, by bishops as a ruse and a cover time and time again.
Quick echo of that. If you read the Bennett report, they make the point that canon law was violated time and time again. That is a far from perfect document, but it functions at a certain level as a kind of secular screed or script. You can pull out 4 or 5 pretty potent paragraphs from that document and just use it each time you want to get coverage. This is what the National Review Board said. Boom. Here's our situation in Winona or wherever. And, I think on canon law, most reporters are curious about it, but I don't think most good journalists would not cover something because they assume at this stage of the crisis that bishops are resorting to canon law as a way of, policing crimes within the ranks.
Next question, please. I'm sorry.
Can I say something about canon law? I had a lot of experience in canon law. I got a doctorate in canon law, and I've been an expert witness and a consultant in 700+ cases. And I can tell you that it has been canon law in many ways that has been the downfall of these dioceses and these bishops, because what we've simply demonstrated, and what I've helped to do with cases in the United States, probably 3/4 of the dioceses and in other countries as well, is simply to show this is the legal system. It's an internal system, and it has not been followed. And all the rules and regulations and the procedures have been there. Had they been done and used correctly, we would not have had this problem. But they were not, and they were not done so intentionally and with malice. So it's been the downfall in many ways.
My name is Steve Tyson. I come from Hudson, Iowa. My abuse occurred in Dubuque, Iowa. And I have 2 questions. The first one is, if we do something like this in Iowa, are you people going to come?
Dave will be there.
Yeah.
If I go back to Dubuque, I'll probably have nervous breakdown. That's what they do. If you're willing to pick up the pieces, man, I'll go back.
If you schedule it, they will come.
I should send you a picture. I think that seminary is now an outlet store. My question is, you use the B word quite a bit tonight, the bishops. My abuser's a nun. She's still alive. And there's other victims in here that are victims of nuns. And quite frankly, gentlemen, we're not hearing nothing about nuns. The bishops are going to claim they have no control over them. So I'd just like to hear some comments.
I can comment on that because I've been involved in several cases involving religious women, both in schools and in orphanages. And the first one, in fact, the night that the verdict came down in Dallas in 1997, I found out about that because I was that very evening being deposed in Washington, D.C. on a big multi-victim case from New Hampshire or Vermont involving sisters, nuns. That issue has not received the prominence because it's been buried much more deeply. And it's a little bit more slippery to get a grip on it. But it is, in fact, there. There's been many more layers of denial and cover-up. And that's why it hasn't gotten the prominence that I think the other issues have. And also, it does not have the criminal nature to it that sexually abusing a little boy does. You got to remember that, the thing that started all this wave off in our era was a highly compulsive, sociopathic, fixated pedophile in Lafayette, Louisiana, who had hundreds of victims. I mean, that was pretty glaring, and that started it all. Had the first situation been someone who'd been abused by a nun. I think it might have been a little bit different. But I think those are facts that we have to live with. And that it's a gradual unfolding, because all of this is covered in layer after layer after layer of denial, of religious duress, and God knows how many other issues that are preventing it all from getting to the surface. But it's happening.
I think one of the other sociological aspects to the nuns' cases, and they're all there in every religious order all the way across the country, and not only just the Franciscans in Rochester, but everywhere. The problem is, the majority of the women's communities will not be around in 20 years, or less. In fact, most of the canonical work I've helped on with religious women's institutes is what to do with the assets, because they're imploding at such a high rate right now, they're just in complete disarray.
You know, the victims are still going to be here though, and I'd like to see the same enthusiasm in all of you for victims of nuns that I see for victims of priests. We try to get Archbishop Flynn to take into consideration the fact of victims of abuse of nuns, before he went to Dallas. And Kevin McDonough, the great Kevin McDonough, told us the bishops would not be interested. I understand that the nuns groups are autonomous. However, if something is wrong, you don't just keep letting it go that way, because that's the way it's always been.
You know, the nun thing, let me just make a comment. I'm involved in this thing on an international level. And I want to say that it is on the screen. And it's very easy, I think, sometimes, you know, when we just look at our own diocese, our own area, and say, nothing's happening in this area. It is on the screen. It has been realized. And it's difficult to deal with because it's new, just as the whole thing with the pedophiles was difficult to deal with 20 years ago because it was new. But the fact is, it is on the screen. Secondly, the legal approach goes right at the bishops, because the bishops are responsible. They're responsible for everything that happens to the faithful in their diocese. Either they knew or they should have known. And the first litigation I was involved in, involving religious women, was in Vermont. The nuns basically went out of business, but they were still around. There was a few of them in their mother house up in Quebec, and the bishop was drawn into that litigation. He was drawn in, and they ended up, it was resolved in favor of, I think, 70-some victims came forward in that orphanage. And the stories were horrendous.
And let me just say very quickly, Steve, you're absolutely right. We all, me especially, have to work on inclusive language. I mean, I'm a very, very slow learner, and I used to say kids, and now I try increasingly to say children and vulnerable adults. And I used to say bishops, and now I try to say bishops and church leaders. And it is really, you know, let's face it, as survivors, we all feel incredibly isolated, and, you know, we don't need to make others feel even more isolated by using, you know, these narrow, outmoded terms. And the point you're making is absolutely right, and I couldn't agree more with Tom, that bishops will split hairs and make these fine distinctions and claim that they're not responsible for religious orders, priests, and brothers, and they're not responsible for nuns, and they're not responsible for seminarians. But we all know that fundamentally, bottom line, as Tom said, they're accountable for every single thing that happens in their diocese, and we have to hold them to that.
You close the head convent down, they figure out where the money's supposed to go.
Yeah.
Doesn't take long to figure that one out.
Dan? Yeah, my name is Dan Dunford. I'm with Mary Mother of the Church in Burnsville, and I'm part of a group named Call to Accountability, and there are 7 members of that group here tonight. About a year ago, we had an apology service for victims, and we had priests, nuns, brothers, and lay people apologize to victims and let them know that it was not their fault and that they were victims of abuse, and try to get them off of shame, which many victims go through. I really came up to talk about what Steve talked about, and that was nuns. There was a report written by a Mary Guntner in Milwaukee, and in it she talks about the nun abuse and she talks about it as a taboo within a taboo. You don't think of women sexually abusing, and certainly within that you don't think and talk about nuns abusing. I challenge all of you, the next time you're speaking on a panel, to talk about nuns abuse. It's just not heard anywhere. Please do that. Thank you.
It's in every cell in my body. My beautiful father has been working on it for 35 years. I do not believe my perpetrator, Father Richard Eckroth from the Collegeville St. John's University, tiptoed around my mother also. Did your camera see me say that? I hope so. I believe that the political system in the state of Minnesota doesn't want to acknowledge that we exist. I do not feel like a human being. I do not feel like a male or a female. There are many issues to address. Pedophilia, define it for the public, having all different professionals define what pedophilia is, that it is a distinct population from the homosexual population is really important. What their motives are, what their activities are, what their agenda is, that they are educated human beings, that this is not beraved performance or something that just happens, an aberration. This is a choiceful act of sexuality, pedophilia. They're choosing to be sexually aroused by humiliating children, intimidating children. I would use terrorizing children.
Can I comment a bit on what you're saying? Because your witness of who you are is tremendously important. And what you're saying is so important. And, your pain is palpable. And some of us know it very deeply. You're making some very good teaching points, and I'd like to comment on one of them, if I can, because it's been neglected here. There is a great problem with understanding the distinction between pedophilia and homosexuality. The point is, if a 35-year-old man picks on a 13-year-old girl, we don't hit ourselves on the forehead and say, there go those damn heterosexuals again. They're at it. We can make a very clear distinction between sexual orientation and object of sexual excitation. The problem of homosexuality in the priesthood is a very distinct one, but is mixed up. It's mixed up with lack of definition that you're asking for, which I think is very important, all of us learning, so that we can understand and help the world solve both of these problems in terms of understanding and in terms of educating and in terms of helping behaviors. You're doing wonderful work and keep at it.
Witnessed the anguish and destruction of my family to such a level that we're dust. We're dust. We're not amongst the living. I'm not saying we're dead. We're in the spirit realm. We're in a different dimension. And we're speaking for the dead. Mary and Susan Recker, my perpetrator, was the lead suspect in their murders. There's no investigation materials in Stearns County left on that initial investigation. Who murdered them in a quarry in St. Cloud, stabbed them multiple times, raped them multiple times, left them with crosses carved in their chests? Why can't we find their murderers? Why was Father Richard Eckroth a suspect, but no longer is? And where is the information that investigator gathered? They're covering up crimes that are much larger than the American public can take. I can't take it. My dad can't take it. Who can take it? This is a really corrupt leadership. It's not that that we need to change them, inform them. It means we need to be very frightened of these people. We need to remove them. We don't ask Cardinal Law to step down or defrock him. We have every legal official in the nation walk into his church and shackle him and drag him out. To us, it's totally humiliating to hear people say, defrock him. I don't want to spend the rest of my life fighting this. I can't. I want to live. I want to have babies. I want to have people who don't look at me and go, oh, that's the girl that was sexually assaulted by a priest. I'm much more.
Look, there are lifelines to you. There are lifelines to you. Can you understand that there are some of us who do understand you?
Yes, this is a forum that is unique for me.
That's right.
But we need you in the national eye on 60 Minutes, on Oprah. No more just tiptoeing in. Go there. Invite that fight in court so that you will be in the news. Invite it. Bring it on.
We do hear you.
We don't have to be polite to these people. We're still doing it with a loving heart. We're protecting all the other children and all the other nations that will never be heard.
We do hear you. We do hear you. I think I know almost everyone on this panel well enough, and those I don't, I can speculate. We do hear you. We will try and be the kind of voice that you can't be. We will try and take your memories.
I want to be that voice. I deserve to be that voice.
We will help you. We will help you. I do it in my own little way. I'm a limited human being. I try and write more and more. I try and understand. I try and do advocacy where I can, when I'm asked to in courtrooms. And you know that I've responded to you the best I could. And I certainly will continue. And you know I have deep feelings for your family because I grew up at St. John's. I grew up, know your dad and know your perpetrator, And I'm abashed, I'm astounded that he has not been confronted more within his own community. And we will not stop doing this. Reach out to us, and we will help you in the ways we can.
They took everything that is essential for development, and yet my dad and my mom are the most beautiful people in the world. They still, even though they've been beat and beat and beat and beat.
And yet they're standing. And this is a testimony to all of us, and this is a witness to all of us. This is an encouragement to all of us. This is a challenge to all of us.
I want my brother to have state-of-the-art. I want him to have state-of-the-art recuperation. I don't want him stuffed away in a state hospital on pharmaceuticals.
Thank you.
Are we done?
I'm not done. You want to?
My name is Susan Pavlak, and it's difficult to get cynical enough sitting in this room, particularly hearing the story we just heard. I am a Catholic woman, and
Can you stand a little closer to the
Yes.
microphone, please?
Yes. I am a Catholic woman, and there are a few of us here. Two of us are here tonight representing an organization called Solidarity. I would invite you to, this is the commercial, to pick up the piece of paper with our name on it in the lobby as you leave, and take a look at our website, and join us if you can. I think we have some answers to how to do away with 4 years of litigation for people like Lizzie. I think we have the answers to how to get victims to come forward, and we would like to invite you to help us build a process whereby that can happen non-adversarially. Thank you.
Thank you.